Hey everyone, happy Friday and welcome to another episode of Plan A Conversations. All right, so we are in a crazy week. And some of you may say, have you been paying attention? It's been a crazy year. And now we're entering to another sphere of just absolute uncertainty on all levels. And so a lot of that I say is purposeful. A lot of that I say is going to support a lot of that is teaching us so much. I know I'm learning so many incredible and valuable lessons. Before we segue into today's conversation, I just want to say thank you so much for all of your DMs, all of your questions, and just feedback about general content that you want for this year. A couple of announcements before we get into today's conversation. Tomorrow, actually starting today, I will be doing a virtual retreat with Susan Miller, Alana Zabel, and Courtney O'Reilly. Please go to my website if you're interested in having a reprieve from all that's happening in the world. I guarantee you it literally is a 3-day of just robust conversation on astrological trends, interestingly enough, wellness, yoga, and all the things that I think are going to be really important in helping us center ourselves as we welcome this new year. Another announcement, next week, I will be welcoming Karen Parsons to the podcast conversation. She was in, I believe, on season 1, and she's back now with a new book about Bessie Coleman. Her work is just absolutely incredible. So be sure to circle back next week for that. And if you have any questions you want to ask Karen, I know there's one question in particular I definitely want to ask her about the 50th reunion for the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. I do have one question for sure for that. So if there's anything you want to talk about, please sure to send me a DM. I would love to ask that question as well. All right, folks, listen, I'm so excited for today's conversation because it's been long overdue. Do you know, and I talk about this all the time, I meet so many incredible and just wonderful people from all walks of life. And just interestingly enough, one summer afternoon, I just returned from Australia and I was walking into my friend's kitchen. I used to live in this fabulous brownstone with a really good mutual friend of ours for today's guest. And there was this bright, very bubbly, very just infectious personality, gorgeous individual. And I said hi, and she said hi. And when I tell you, we have just had the most amazing conversations. We've been a part of some really interesting experimental programs, like at the 92nd Street Y, around the Ben Franklin circles, wellness and unity, and trying to create levels of partnership through different lens of understanding, and just so much more. I can't tell you how many just amazing dinner conversations I've had with this young lady, and she's here to talk to us about some really interesting things that she's working on, and to also shed light on her incredible journey. And I know that's a lot of information, but Barbara Chen, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Clay. Great to see you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's so great to have you here. And so, Barbara, just for our audience, I think just maybe right out the gate to sort of level set the conversation, what is your intention for having today's talk?
Oh, my goodness. Well, I think the first thing that I want to do is just really, as you have shared with me, this concept of strengthening my courage muscle. So, perhaps ironic to the different jobs I have been privileged to hold, I find myself at a place in my career where, despite years and actually decades of experience, I am not a courageous voice. I know there is much for me to share, including knowledge that I can leverage, and experience that is relevant to a lot of things happening in our country and certainly in our city. But I have been at a bit of a loss as to how to leverage all of that. And so I think my first intention is, just by speaking with you and answering questions that you may have, I think I'll be led perhaps to a little more clarity.
I absolutely love that piece because so many guests come on the podcast, and number one question they always have for me is, hey, if I don't have it all figured out, is it okay to talk with you and your listeners? And I guarantee you, Barbara, these are the best kind of conversations to have. And the audience themselves, they're always saying, thank you for bringing people on who are trying to figure it all out just like me. And again, I am trying to do that as well. Like none of us are experts of life. We're all trying to do it day in and day out. And when you speak of sort of strengthening that courage muscle, let's sort of take a step back and walk our listeners through who is Barbara and what has she been working on up until this point of inflection that is supporting her desire to be more courageous? What is that work?
Oh, thank you for the question. It's almost like I might tell you a truly too long story. So you let me know.
Yeah, break it down.
But I guess, if I go back to the first job I had in New York City, that's sort of the beginning of it often for many of us. And mine was at ABC News Network. And I started there having majored in journalism and relocated from California. And this was November of 2001. And I had lots of interest in working in television news. And I had a good run at ABC. I was there for 5 years, and I had been promoted and held. I was an assignment editor. I was a control room producer. I did not pursue any on-air reporting. I was sort of interested in how we synthesize, gather, and then explain information to audiences. And then I got to a point in probably 2005. This was, there was Hurricane Katrina, the Southeast Asian tsunami, and I would spend, sometimes a minimum maybe of 60 hours a week in a dark control room, and you would just see a lot of feeds of footage, really depressing, heavy footage coming out of destruction and despair. And I felt if I was going to spend so many hours working, that it ought to be to some greater good. And I started thinking that I wanted to work in nonprofits. But as a journalist, as a news producer, I didn't really have what I felt at the time was the experience necessary. So I started putting feelers out, as we do, and, like putting it out there into the universe and letting people know, I think I want to go into nonprofits, so on and so forth. And probably a little less than a year into my search, while continuing to work at the network, I got a call completely unexpected from the New York City Police Department, and ended up going to work for the NYPD for its Deputy Commissioner of Public Information, who's the chief department spokesperson. And I was, I eventually became the director of media relations. I was appointed as a special assistant for media. And that was not a job that I expected. At the time that the NYPD called me, I truly thought I had left my wallet somewhere, like that they were calling me because I lost my wallet. And, it was the result of somebody that I'd talked to in my network having shared with the man who would become my boss, that she knew of somebody who might be interested in other work. And it was timing. My predecessor, the person who I replaced, had left the NYPD and gone to work for then Mayor Bloomberg to become one of his press secretaries. So I went to the police department having no experience covering the police, certainly because working at the network, I was covering international and national news, not New York City level news. And I also, I grew up in Los Angeles during the Rodney King riots. The idea of working for a law enforcement agency or a police department was never something that I remotely considered.
Did you have any ambivalence at all?
I had a great deal of curiosity. Like, why would they want me to work for them? Just on first from a professional point of view, for all the reasons I just stated, and then B, right. I just like, well, this could be an interesting experience, right? Like to just look inside, even as an interviewee. Right. But I also did my research, and one of the things that struck me was the man who was effectively inviting me to come interview with him, he had been a journalist. He had been a news bureau chief in Albany. He had gone to Columbia Journalism School, so I also saw a person, in a much more advanced place in his life and career who had made this transition from journalism to public service. And I thought, well, that's worth talking about too.
Totally.
So I went, and, I also, I didn't even know who the police commissioner was. And I remember, one of the first things I did when I got to the newsroom, having gotten this call from the NYPD, I called the man in the newsroom who was known to like have all these law and justice contacts. And I said, who is Paul Brown? He was like, Paul Brown called you? Like, you need to take that call, and proceeded to explain to me that this was a very influential person who worked for probably the second most powerful person in New York City, and so on and so forth. But there were other pieces of it that were very intriguing. The police commissioner who was Ray Kelly, I didn't know this, but he had worked for President Clinton. He had headed the Interpol in Haiti. Like, he had a wide range of experience that was also beyond New York City. And I just thought, well, this is completely different, and Clay, at the time, because I had been looking, I went and I had interviewed with Martha Stewart, with Martha Stewart living Omni Media. And they simultaneously offered me a job as, for what was then just emerging XM satellite radio.
Oh,
and,
wow.
Yeah, it was like, well, they basically offered me something like, I don't know, like supervising producer of like some radio show. And I remember thinking, well, that's kind of the same smell in a different armpit, like with the news media I'm already in.
Exactly.
And I also had this terribly oversimplified view of Martha Stewart, of being like pie crust and gardening tools. And I was like, I think that the police might be more exciting. So I ended up going there. But your question about ambivalence, and sorry for getting so long to answer.
No, this is excellent.
It was, I think subconsciously, there was a lot of ambivalence. I mean, I came from a childhood that was not subject to a lot of police interaction, but the interaction that was there was not positive. As a female and as an Asian female, the limited interactions that I had also were not of the nature of many police encounters that we hear about, often tragically, in our news media and in what's sort of popular coverage of law enforcement. So I did have ambivalence, as I said, and I think I even said this in my interview, getting to the question of why they were interested in me, that I would not have chosen to work for the LAPD based purely on my impressions as a youth growing up in a suburb of Los Angeles. But I did see from, the sort of like practical objective part of me saw this as a very unique opportunity. And I remember coming back to the newsroom and telling my colleagues, well, if they hire me and I fail spectacularly, I still will have been inside one of the most storied institutions there is. So the mere opportunity to gain that insight was enough, to sort of to go and see. And so I took that job and I ended up staying for 7 years.
Wow. You stayed for 7 years.
Yeah.
Take us through your journey of maybe what you saw and the emotions, I think, within 7 years of being a part of this kind of work. I can imagine an ebb and flow of seeing things you like, seeing things you didn't like, things that, may have questioned why you were there, things may have validated why you were there.
Right.
Walk us through that journey.
Oh, these are such great questions. I mean, well, number one, the cultural education, right? I think we all have, largely based on film and television and the sort of Hollywood fetishization of police.
Mm-hmm.
Impressions of police culture.
Mm.
Whether it's sort of like, soldier mentality or like a dumb donut eating cop, and when you look at the range of caricatures that exist around police and policing, that's what I went in with. Not to say that I had expectations that, I was better than them in any way. I just knew that I was walking into something completely unknown. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
just from even just a gender point of view and a generational point of view, when you're in a newsroom in New York City, ABC News is on the Upper West Side, very well heeled, well coiffed, coiffed, you know what I mean?
Yes.
Well manicured, people, and pretty diverse, definitely a lot of people within my peer age group. Going into the NYPD, I wasn't at a precinct. I was in headquarters in Lower Manhattan. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it is what you would expect. It's male dominant.
Mm-hmm.
It is. I was working with men who were more than twice my age,
Mm-hmm.
reporting to men more than twice my age, and the people in my office who were closest to my age were probably still. I started there before I was 30, and I
Oh,
think that
wow.
most of the people in my office, even the youngest among them, was probably about 10 years older, and
Mm-hmm.
all were officers,
Right.
sworn police. Because I was in a civilian-led command and I was in a civilian capacity, I was not a sworn officer of the law in any way. The officers were in plain clothes, but I mean, even just to go and interview, I remember seeing basically a bunch of men looking at me and being, when I was led through to the man who was interviewing me, it's like, notice like the gun on the hip, the gun in the holster.
Right.
It's not like in the movies where they're wearing, shields on their necks. I mean, you might see that in a precinct more, but
Mm-hmm.
culturally there's that. I also, as a person coming to, at that point I'd been in New York 5 years. I've now been a New York City resident for almost 20. But
Mm.
when I went to work for the NYPD, I also learned there are many different New York accents. We sort of,
Many.
yeah, right. I mean, people who know there's a difference between the sort of classic vintage Manhattan accent and a Long Island accent. But there is also a difference between Brooklyn and, Staten Island and the Bronx.
Right.
And it's like these little things. There were some sort of fun cultural things that I learned,
Mm-hmm.
like they would love to enlighten me as to where to get the best pizza or pie,
Right.
um, people would start thinking about lunch at 10:30, which I used to be annoyed by, but actually in retrospect, that's also a function of shift work, right? So there,
Mm-hmm.
the working in a public agency and certainly for the police, it's very shift based. So people work midnights, people work 4 to 12, people work
Mm-hmm.
7 to 3. Not many people do a 9 to 5. Even I, as a quote unquote 10 to 6, like you worked a
Mm-hmm.
ton of overtime, you didn't get paid overtime.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a vernacular that I came to learn just by exposure and immersion, and
Mm-hmm.
they were very leery of me. It was very clear
I
that
bet.
the
Um,
media were not people that were friendly to the police.
Even inter-agent, like
Even it was such a. I remember once being at like a plan. I mean, it was when I say planning meeting, there were probably like 4 people in the room, and it was something
Mhm.
as benign as we were going to set up a press conference of some kind. And, this is me. I work in this office. My
Right.
function is media relations. So I had my notebook and I was like taking notes, right? And I remember this lieutenant, comes into my office afterward and he's like, I see you had your little notebook there. And I'm like, why would I not have a notebook?
I'm in
And it was
media.
sort of this like insinuation that I was going to like share some kind of like secret, and it was a funny thing because at the same time, it was very clear to me that a lot of some of the senior officers also have relationships with the New York City media. There
Mm.
definitely were long-standing relationships, and there's a funny yin and yang that happens there as well. Like the media coverage of the police and to what extent police influence it, but also media coverage in general of police typically not being about positive stuff, which
Right.
I also understand. Like, you're not going to find a station that makes news all the time out of something that is maybe if it's extremely heroic,
Hmm.
saving a suicidal person from jumping off the Verrazano Bridge in the middle of a windstorm, which
Hmm.
happened, things like that. But your sort of day to day community relations efforts, those things are not going to make the news.
Right. And how did you build trust with them? Because I could imagine that was something that had to be enforced at some point
Right.
to start to strengthen those relationships
Yeah,
for the things you
absolutely.
just mentioned. Yeah.
I think that it was a matter of time. Like, this is what I genuinely believe. I don't think there was anybody. If they were, it was not apparent to me. And again, I had a limited experience, or I had a special experience being in headquarters versus in a precinct. It wasn't like
Hmm.
there was anybody who was racist or misogynist. It
Hmm.
was more. It's very just specific to me. Like, who was I?
Hmm.
It was very clear that there was a great amount of affection for my predecessor, who happened to
Hmm.
be a tall white man. I'm like this little Asian person, and not the physicality has anything to do with it, but I always, it was like always so obvious. Like, there's that, I don't know if it was Sesame Street. It's like, which one of these things is not like the other? Like, that was clearly me. Like, and I think one of the ways that we did build trust was through humor and through food, right? It's like,
Hmm.
what was there was a detective who sat outside my office, and he would always tease me for eating birdseed. And he would tell me, like, I wouldn't get sick so often if I would have a cheeseburger now and then.
Uh,
And I would share like nutrition. Like, I used to bring like a big Tupperware of spinach and tofu and like stereotypically crunchy West Coast, stuff. And but the same lieutenant who had suspicions that I was like, I don't know, selling state secrets with my notebook, he wanted to know what I was eating. He thought that
mm,
his wife might be interested. And some of it sounds very like old school and a little bit
mhm,
patronizing, but really it was sort of like we had to find topics over which we could safely converse, because we
mhm,
were not going to jump into, how do you properly conduct a stop? You know what I
mhm,
mean? Like, over
mhm,
time, I remember being able to ask, like, why is it, like, why can't you shoot to wound? Why isn't that an option? But that it took time, because I had to feel friendly with the chief
mhm,
whom I asked. Also, individual personalities. He had a personality that I knew I could ask him that question, and he wasn't going to be
mhm,
defensive, and he would also tell me the truth.
mhm,
Um, I think just by being who I was, right? Like, being respectful, being willing to listen, not being the expert, which I really
mm,
was hired to be. Like, I was
right,
hired to run around with the police commissioner and, chaperone, for lack of a better word, his media appearances, and,
mhm,
write statements, write press
mhm.
releases, write speeches. And I had.
So who were you like, whose best interests were you serving? Was it the NYPD? Was it the people? Was it a conglomerate of all involved? Like, what was your beat? What was your focus?
Yeah, well, it's a great question, and I'm remembering a moment that where it was made very clear to me, and it was like early in the job,
Mhm,
and I think we had a request from a news station to cover something. I don't even remember what it was, And I remember going to my boss and sort of, saying that I thought maybe we could offer them X, Y, and Z information or opportunity to see, such and such. And I remember he said, he was sort of, I think he was not in agreement, let's just say. And I remember that I realized it and I said, oh, you know what? I'm sorry. I think I'm just thinking like a television producer. And he said, well, I need you to think like you work for us. Like I need you, I think I had said something like, oh, I have my journalist hat on. Like I was trying to make an excuse for why I had this idea that apparently maybe he didn't agree with. And he said, well, I need you to put your NYPD hat on. And so to answer your question, my job was to facilitate their exchange of information with the media. And having said that, there's also, the media serve a public education function, right? It can be argued. And it's also like, okay, well, what information is important to get out to the media and to the public? And I guess, some of the more extreme examples would be there was an attempted car bombing in Times Square in May of 2010. And I had to respond to the scene. And it was the first Saturday in May. And, Times Square, arguably the most densely populated place in the most densely populated city in the country. And it had been evacuated because of a potential terrorist threat. And, it's like, okay, what information did we have? What information could I share? What information could compromise an investigation, the very contours of which were just beginning to take shape? There's a lot of like information swimming around, not all of which is relevant or useful to share. But, it was sort of like my phone is blowing up, right, from CNN and other news outlets. And, like, is this real? Is this real? And it's like, well, I don't know if we're at a point where we can say it isn't real, but we know that we've got to take all the precautions necessary. It's like, what's responsible to share? And my first responsibility was to figure out what was happening.
Did you feel the weight of being like the gatekeeper for the external perspective or point of view and how we would view the NYPD?
Yeah. And where I felt that weight very acutely was actually in my personal life. So I think there's the first question people always asked when they found out that I worked for the NYPD was, sometimes humorously and sometimes not, could I fix tickets? Right? Which I thought was so indicative of two things. One, almost like I don't want to call it petty, but like the just day-to-day living nuisances that people first associated with police, which is really which is traffic enforcement, which is actually that's a different agent. It's not a police officer. But in any case, so that's one, and that also rang true in a lot of community forums. Like we would have community forums for the high holy days. We would have community forums for Ramadan. We would have, almost always people wanted to know how they could deal with parking around their mosque or around the synagogue, or like it was, and maybe that's also a New York thing.
Yeah.
But then the other piece of that is the implication that there is widespread corruption, that even if they were joking that you could fix a ticket, which kind of offended me, because it's like I felt defensive, like, okay, now I have to sort of explain that no, I cannot and would not, but B, like, again, the implication is that people do that, and certainly there have been reported cases and investigations related to that. And I'm sure in many other cities as well. But where I felt it was, people had a mixture of, enthusiasm around it. Like I had a girlfriend who every time we were out at a bar loved to tell people that I worked for the police. And I used to feel so self-conscious, like, why are you telling everyone? Like I'm off duty, you know?
Right.
But then it would turn into one of two things. People would either share their appreciation for law enforcement, and far more often, people would share their issues with law enforcement. And then my Saturday night or my conversation at the wedding reception would then turn into a conversation of issues with policing, which may or may not even have been about New York City, but really about policing in general.
In general,
Yeah.
wow.
And then, so then you're in a position, what I learned to do is to sort of listen and to see where the person was coming from, and then to always clarify where I was coming from, what my role was. But I did feel a pressure, because I also felt that I was not necessarily, despite my appointment to this position, that I was not necessarily I didn't want to speak for my bosses, let's say, you know.
Right.
I could say to you, Clay, anecdotally and personally what my feeling was, but I wouldn't necessarily, you know, it's like, where's the line? Which I think is what you're getting at, between like what I felt, saw, and knew, and what was or wasn't happening in the public sphere. And sometimes, depending on the news of the time, those things could get embroiled. And I often felt a lot of discomfort with that, you know, because you go ahead.
No, you go. This is good.
I just remember specifically one wedding, and I remember being at it was like a more casual sort of backyard wedding. And one of the guests found out through small talk, like we all make, where I worked, and really dug in. Like, why do the police always stop my friend when he gets off the subway? You know, why this? And I could talk through those things. And, you know, the first thing is like, well, where does your friend live? Right. So the assumption that what he was getting at is like, he had a friend who was a doctor, who was Black, and his friend was stopped all the time. Why was he being stopped? And you know, the first thing is like to acknowledge, well, first of all, if there's any disrespect, mistreatment, or abusive behavior, that needs to be reported. But if you're really asking me why he is stopped and he's done nothing, I can only say first, like, I understand how frustrating that is for your friend, and obviously for you on your friend's behalf. But where does he live? Does he live in a neighborhood where there is where it's a higher crime neighborhood? You know, and then it turns into this other thing, like, so maybe that's a fair response for there being more police, but why is he stopped repeatedly? Okay. Is it possible that we are assuming that it's the same police officer stopping him every time, that the police officer stopping him should know that it's him and not stop him? You know, it's like that we live in a city of 8.5 million people. We live in a city where we have the largest police department in the country. On scale, the New York City Police Department is tens of thousands of officers. The majority of police agencies in the country are, you know, in the hundreds and fewer. So the point being, there are many officers, there are many New York City residents. Is it possible for your friend to be recognized and you know, for it to be understood that he's not, you know, he shouldn't be stopped? It's like, if your job as a police officer is to respond to an area because there has been a rape, and the only information reported by the victim is race, maybe approximate height, you know, she didn't get a look at the person's face, there weren't distinctive markings, then unfortunately, that's the only information that the police are using. Again, to me, the bigger question is, how is he being treated when he is stopped? Because I really do think very often it's about, you know, if you can treat somebody with respect and not make them feel, I mean, it's an inconvenience, number one, but it's a very negative thing and it's very scary, right, to be
Right.
stopped. I mean, I as a member of the department sometimes would be mistaken for media, and I remember once I was yelled at, and in different settings, and it's like, did you really need to come at me that strongly? So I can
Hmm.
only imagine, like, but anyway, long way of getting back to this conversation at the wedding, where again, I'm trying to be a fellow guest at a wedding,
Right.
not have a debate about whether somebody has been wronged, and again, but not wanting to suggest that they haven't been wronged, also
Hmm.
wanting to offer like avenues for um, being able to report if he has been wronged, and then also context, like the individual who was interrogating me was not really a New Yorker, or had not been in New York very long, and he came from Arizona.
Hmm.
And and I really think, like, look, I can't speak for whatever police practices or habits are in your hometown, but when you say, you experienced X, that's not the same department, right? And again,
Hmm.
I'm not suggesting that there aren't misbehaviors and discourtesies and
Hmm.
injustices that are common. I'm just saying, like, when you're in an interpersonal conversation where
Of
somebody's, you know
course.
what I mean? So
Yeah.
it's like I frequently felt like I would be in a conversation where there wasn't any true seeking of understanding,
Hmm.
and um, that one person would leave deflated. It was really hard to keep up the
Mm.
spiritual energy to engage in a gracious way, when really part of me was like, listen, man, I just want to enjoy this wedding. Like,
Yeah, and no, and I think you're hitting the nail on sort of a twofold conversation. That first piece, and I really do think being able to come to the table and have a conversation is being able to have a conversation. And so many times, even for me as a Black male who has had that similar kind of experience in Michigan and Texas, and a matter of fact, Arizona, in New York City, you run the gamut of stepping back and saying to yourself, if I am a singular Black person, none of these law enforcement agencies or departments are interconnected. They're not being run by the exact same, person, or in the exact same city or municipality. Why am I seemingly having the same
again and
experience
again.
and again and again?
Yeah.
And then, you're trying to have a conversation with someone, and I will have to admit, for me, sometimes it's almost impossible to hear the other person's point of view when you're saying, this is my lived experience. I can't be, the only just anomaly if it's me, my cousin, my,
Right.
brother, and things like
Right.
that.
Right.
And at the same time, though, being able to have the room to hear your perspective and where you're coming from.
Well, and I think that's exactly, it's having, do we really make room to hear? Because by the same measure, I needed to make room to hear him, right?
Right.
And we're talking about somebody in third party, right? Like,
Hmm.
his friend is not there to share his grievance with me. He's speaking on behalf of his friend, and it's his grievance because he's hurt seeing his friend hurt. And I get that. And one thing that I will say is, like, that those lived experiences, which, in 2012, we didn't call them lived experiences. They were just like
Right.
what happened.
Hmm.
There is undoubtedly a continuum in this country, and far predating my time at the NYPD, of indignities, injury, injustice, and injustices at the interpersonal level, injustices at a systemic level. There's a whole continuum of wrongs for which we have to account. And I think that an important place to start, and that's why the movement of now last year, 2020, really was a reckoning, because more people other than you and me, other than people of color, started to really think about the potential of that continuum and the potential
Mm.
harm of that continuum. And we cannot heal, resolve, or co-create solutions
Mhm.
if a part of the solution isn't to first acknowledge, like, that
Yeah,
is a truth, right? That is a truth.
right.
And I think that was a big part of it, is like, I could not deny that this was happening to his friend, no more than any police agency can deny that this is a reality for its residents. And
Hmm.
I think finally, I hope we are at a point where, nobody, and I've heard New York City police officers in public performance, and I don't mean in the performative sense, I mean literal performances, which you and I might get to, which are the result of
Yeah.
empathy training through theater. I've heard them
Mhm.
talk about, their recognition of a disparity in treatment of Black and Brown New Yorkers, but also some of those officers are themselves um, Black or Hispanic and have grown up in public housing, and they will say, I also know what it's like to be living in a certain neighborhood. So it's like some people are able to say it didn't bother me, I moved on, and other people may have been treated differently. Other people may have been treated the same, but can't move on, right? And then one
Mm.
place where it really hits home for me is to listen to, like, I think, now we're at an age where a lot of our friends have children.
Right.
And when I listen to my friends who are women of color and who are Black women and who have young Black sons, and they experience such visceral fear and
Mhm.
heartbreak and disgust and anger, right, at the cases that we see in this country, that is something that makes it much more palpable. And I've seen that, in on social media, where the wives of police officers, all of whom are not people of color, have even commented. I'm speaking specifically about people in the place in my hometown in Southern California,
Mhm.
um, who became cops, and then their spouses saying, like, this was the first year that they began to say, I thought about it. I understand, like, nobody should have to fear calling for
Mhm.
help. Nobody should have to fear, X, Y, and Z. So there is so much room and reason for reform
Mhm.
in law enforcement, but that's also so complex and is going to take time and cannot be rushed, and needs to be multifaceted.
And this is why I'm so interested in talking to you, Barbara, in particular, because so we have like the beginning part of your experience with NYPD and your own lived experience as a Asian American woman there. Walk us through, especially, I think, your departure. What led you to decide that this was no longer where you wanted to be? And what were some of your takeaways for a work that you would start to create a little bit later?
Oh, I'm like, should I tell the real story? I mean, the truth is, I could have stayed, but through no ambition of my own. So, as an appointee, we're all hired at will, private and public sector, but I was hired
Mhm.
not through civil service examination. I was appointed. I was a special appointee of the police commissioner, who's an appointee of the mayor. In
Mhm.
2014, the mayors changed.
Mhm.
Bloomberg left, and de Blasio came in, and de Blasio had appointed Bill Bratton to be police commissioner again. It's interesting. Both Ray Kelly and Bill Bratton, have been New York City police commissioners twice. So Bratton comes in, and his I just the term brain trust just formed in my mind, and I don't want to use it, but it's sort of funny. The people who were working on Bratton's transition
Mhm.
um, appointed me to, like, part of his strategy team,
Mhm.
but didn't tell me this. And I, meanwhile, I'm at the last few months of December of 2013, which are the busiest. The end of the year is so busy for the New York City Police Department. we didn't have it this year because of the pandemic, but the New Year's Eve countdown in Times Square, that's a mass major event. And the New York
Mhm.
City Police Department is responsible for securing it. It's a major media event. There's all these, and there's like end of year crime. I mean, there's all kinds, it's a busy time. It's not like a relaxed holiday time.
Mhm.
But anyway, I'm going into the last quarter of 2013 thinking, okay, I need to find a job because there's no guarantee that I'm staying. And also I was so burnt out, Clay. I was ready to do
Mhm.
something else. Like I was ready.
Mhm.
I had been on call. That job was an on-call position. So
Oh,
I
wow.
was going to emergency rooms in the middle of the night. If
Mhm.
something happened on a weekend, you worked on a weekend,
Mhm.
that I think the day that you and I met, I remember it was a weekend and
It
I had
was.
gone to work. And then, because I don't know, a helicopter crashes in the Hudson River or a cold case is solved. It doesn't matter when it is, you go to work. Also, the media appetite is voracious. And
Mhm.
we're in the media capital of the world. The attention to this police department and to this city is
Mhm.
global,
Mhm.
so it was a lot of work for many years, and I was ready to do something different.
And
And
before we
yeah,
just go on, I'm really curious too. Being a very strong, having strong faith, a very spiritual person. I think you identify as Christian.
yes.
How did that in any way? Were your faith was your faith stretched? Were you pushed to the limit? Was it like better?
My faith sustained me, Clay. And let me
Wow.
tell you I actually, I think in the first year that I was at the police department, a Christian friend of mine asked me to speak at like a women's leadership conference with her church.
Hmm.
And so in preparation for that, I was reflecting on the great gift. I don't think it's shocking for anyone to hear that, this is a very traditional agency and that in many ways it's so old school. I mean, it was founded 175 years ago. But one of the elements of tradition that I actually found very comforting was before every ceremony, there is an invocation, there's prayer. I mean, this was a job where, of any job, because of the potential sacrifice and because of the nature of the work, right? I think it's like the one job where you better have some faith, because if you didn't, I don't know how you would do it. I don't know how you get through learning about, the violent and tragic deaths of young people. How do you, like, what repair is there if
Hmm.
you don't have something else to draw from? And I the other thing is, um, the diversity of faith. Like, it was at the New York City Police Department that I really learned about the High Holy Days and Ramadan. That the first place I met a Muslim chaplain.
Hmm.
There was a Muslim chaplain, just as there was a Roman Catholic um, chaplain, in the police department. So to be in a place where, as a matter of course, you prayed to, and it didn't dictate to whom you prayed.
Hmm.
And I am obviously, people are free to honor and to demonstrate or not display any personal faith.
Hmm.
But it was a place where, for those few moments going into a ceremony or coming out of a funeral, you did gather together, and bow heads, and that was very special. And I found, like, because of the fragility of human life and the ways it could be cherished and the ways that it could be lost, you sometimes I felt that much closer to my God, right? That
Hmm.
it was there's some reason that I'm here. Today may be really hard. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's only to witness the breathtaking, life saving that happened to happen today. Maybe it's to show me that where there is something that maybe we feel can be corrected, we've got to continue to work toward that correction. I mean, that's part of what I'm still figuring out. But I mean, so that's a long way of saying like faith was very overt.
Yeah. And so, Barbara, this is going to have to be part one. I knew that this would be, and this will be the setup because if I'm listening to this podcast, we're in 74 countries now. So I imagine people are over around the world saying, but there's so much that's happening right now,
Yeah.
with policing, and particularly in big metropolitan, cities. I want to know a little bit more. And also you have a lot of really interesting creative projects that I would love for you to have the time to talk about. And so what I would love to do is invite you back for part two. We'll have a break in between and have Karen Parsons share her incredible work, and we'll have you at the second half to come back with this. But before you go, can you just give us a little teaser as to the work that your former work with NYPD is informing right now, and so that we can pick right back up for part two?
Yes, thank you. Well, I'll just say every job I had after the NYPD had nothing to do with law enforcement, but did have to do with innovation in city government or had to do with what it means to be part of a community and inclusion and belonging and, sort of cultural and programmatic interventions that were all about dialogue and how we can coexist despite our differences. And every job I had, I don't know if I would say I missed the police department. I did not miss a lot of the labor and heartache of that job. But I always felt almost like an obligation in some way. Like I couldn't have worked there for 3/4 of a decade and then completely moved on.
Right.
Every time, a negative and true story would come up in the media related to police in any city, I felt heartache. And I felt it also for my former colleagues. I felt it for the police whom I knew to be good people. I felt like, what solutions can there be? Why haven't there been better solutions? So fast forward to 2021. So now I've been out of the police department as many years as I was in. And before George Floyd and before the most recent Black Lives Matter movement, I did start in 2020 to look at programs that involved, but were about working with, but also changing aspects of police. And one of those is here in Brooklyn, and it's a theater they're called the Irondale Ensemble, and they created a program in 2015. After I had left, I had nothing to do with this, and I only learned about it, recently, that brings together police and community members for 10 weeks and uses improvisational acting and theater as a way to build empathy between what might be opposing sides. And it really is about, vulnerability, yes, but personal story and putting yourself in other people's shoes. And beyond that, it creates a place where with intention, so it happens organically, but it is a very intentional curriculum, if you will, and method that gets people week after week to increasingly see the other as human, which I know sounds like, how could we, that's why don't we already do that? Well, we don't. There's a lot of demonization. We see it in partisan politics. We see it in media. It's been the pervasive theme before and certainly during this last administration, right? So now I'm getting to work as a co-director of this program and trying to expand it both in New York City as well as get it into other cities across the country, but also really conduct like an internal efficacy study to sort of see like, why does this work? It goes very deep, but how do we reach more people? And
Mm,
also, relative to reforming law enforcement, while accountability and transparency efforts are necessary and worthwhile, the problem that I have with them is that they are after the fact. So when you talk about you talk about putting all cops who
mm,
did XYZ in a database. You talk about disciplining and holding accountable cops who performed badly or misbehaved or committed crimes. Yes, those things are necessary. However, police are not going away, right? And even if they're being adjusted, where we have to do something and do it soon is in how we recruit and screen, hire
mm,
and train and monitor police, right? And I don't want to put down police who perform admirably or nobly. What I'm saying is we need more of those police. We need
mm,
more people to become those police officers. We can't leave that to chance. So yes,
right.
we have to root out the so-called bad apples. We have to recognize that the system is flawed if it allows for these apples, so-called apples. But it's also, I really think, in these more preventative measures. And then also in the middle are these programs where, again, like, how do we really come to understand each other? And then what do we take away from this program, this dialogue, and give to our systems of governance, give to leadership to act on?
Mm. And see, if I'm listening to this as well, talk about like the perfect storm, the perfect remedy for you to have this journalism background, to be a communicator, to go in as a media person for the NYPD, one of the largest in the country. And then to continue your work on around inclusion, diversity, equity issues, and now smack dab in the middle of a world big pandemic, especially as it relates to United States isms,
Yeah.
policing. Like if that is not purpose driven work, or if that's not like a specific sort of a set of circumstances setting you up for what I would say potentially part of your plan A, I don't know what is.
Right.
I have so many other questions for you, Barbara, and we are going to definitely have a part two. Just in part one, if there's someone who is interested in reaching out and connecting with you to learn more about the work you are doing and even where you want to take this work, where can they learn more about you?
I don't even have a website related to this work, which I've been doing,
Hmm.
kind of under the radar. But I can share my email address if that's something that we can
Yeah.
broadcast. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So
Okay.
what I always do is I have the guest mini bio and a contact email or whatever they choose to use
Yeah.
for communication at the base of the podcast. So listen, folks, this conversation is just starting. I'm even seeing probably part two and part three because it's a really important. We're at a precipice in our nation's history like never before. And I think it's going to take people like Barbara who have seen the ins and the outs of this very important policing issue to step up to the forefront and to share what they have to say in a much more purposeful way. And what I love about what you were saying, Barbara, from the very beginning about that empathy piece, you said it's not really the vulnerability is what you're trying to get at, it's the empathy piece. And I think even for next part two, we'll start with that and then hear more about the ins and outs of your work, because the more people who know about what you are doing, your background, the more I think that you'll need to be in front of these big conversations that are happening. Because I think from my vantage point as even a person, a black person, a black male who a lot of these things are happening to, I have my preconceived notions and I come with my biases around that. And even just talking to you for a little bit in part one, I'm like, I actually didn't think about what their, experience is like, and then that level of coming together and having a conversation, because that's something that's not modeled really well for
It is
us in the
not.
United
It is
States.
not.
Yeah.
And it's something and that's one of the things that I want to change, or that I hope to see change
Yeah.
in law enforcement culture. It's like, how do you have a conversation with someone that is just more open, more neutral? How do we achieve that? Like I almost, it's almost hard for me even to describe, the default, though we know is not that. And there are obviously circumstances where that may not be appropriate or possible,
Mhm.
but there are plenty where it should be.
Yeah. And I can't wait to talk to you about the faith part. You talked about it a little bit, but I could imagine being someone on the inside as well as someone now on the side, on the external part of it, and seeing all that's happening. Is there a reckoning with one's faith as well? Folks, Barbara, first, let me thank you for
You.
this time and for trusting me and sharing this evolving story that you're working to create. You're doing some really great work, and I can't wait to see where this takes you. Thanks so much for being for a part of Plan A Conversations Part 1. So listen, folks, Barbara will be back next week. We're so excited to welcome Karen Parsons. She's talking about her Sweet Blackberry series, where she explores a lot of, well, not a lot of, but African-American stories that have not been a part of the forefront. I love what she did with her first work and also her series on Netflix. So be sure to check that out. Again, you can learn more about me by visiting clayswilliams.com. And I'm on all your favorite social media by the handle of @PlanA with Clay. That's @PlanA with Clay, folks. And remember, Clay is with a K. Stay tuned for part 2 of this incredible conversation with Barbara Chen. Look forward to seeing you in the very next episode of Plan A Conversations.